Our story continues. We journey now to the port city of Vlissingen in the Dutch province of Zeeland. The Gregorian calendar puts us firmly in 1604, where the prevailing Shadow Society gathers for their decennial assembly of order and ceremony. Driven further into the future by a collaborative understanding of their own earthly impermanence, this collaboration of the anointedly wealthy began to accept impervious rebels and the globally minded to their righteous cause. 113 do-gooders, hand-picked by prominent members of the Ring from across Europe, were welcomed to the initial festivities of the rare event in the daytime. When night fell, the Ring's next regime of operations would be decided upon. All the while, Belphegor picked at the increasingly loose fabric of reality. Time passed him differently, but the impervious doldrums remained a constant. On occasion, his finger might slip and something might change, but without all the pieces falling into place, the embellisher of calamity would remain the melancholy messiah. The barrier betwixt the remnants and their better halves needed to be pierced from both sides before it would be safe to pass through. A plot nearly 479 years in the making, and a delicate one at that. You're listening to episode 6 of Pulp, Surreal Stories from a Nearby Skull, an audio zine presented by the Sleepy Bones Detective Agency. The following broadcast is intended for mature audiences only. Under the grand jurisdiction of the Ring, all citizens of the harbour city were bound to their homesteads on punishment of death. The meeting drew on from 6 a.m. until 11 p.m. and covered the unveiling of Europe's largest warship. The Dutch were famed sailors, and where better to control the world from than its oceans? As the proprietor of histories, the Ring had been waiting for technology to catch up with their ideals. You see, even as late as the 17th century, there was much left to be discovered hidden amongst the ocean's waves. In order to capitalize on this, it was ordered that several hundred members of the organization would board this impeccable vessel and set sail towards the southern hemisphere to birth a new world. It would be the maiden voyage of the Sonnet, stocked with a fortress of the more disposable members, to be led by a chosen few who would, in turn, be replaced by proxies. But these disposables, these impervious rebels, had all come from one family, born a second time from a single mother, or rather, her story. She had passed centuries ago by this point, but the sect that she inspired still carried her ashes, and they still carried his coal. It was held by their leader, somebody who had been chosen by the being from beneath them. Many generations of leadership had passed too, and all the children of Nahash had done was wander. Liberté was different. The coal had spoken to her in a way that it had not done for any of their fleeting heartbeats. It gave her the call of the roaring tides, and she simply followed until it ceased to echo. Having stumbled upon this, Liberté had been named as such prior to her submission to calamity. A war hero and a revolutionary who freed Brittany from the tyranny of Albert the Forgotten, and now a member of the upper echelon of the Ring. A pawn in the game, and yet the brains behind its final design. Between cold-calling initiates, infiltration, and now this mass dissemination of those they deemed disposable, her children now outnumbered true members of the Ring 2-1. Not a cancerous act of revenge for the exile of Nahash herself, but a military outfit crusading for the embellishment of calamity. With the ocean lapping behind them, Liberté slashed the throat of whatever king had introduced her to this society in the first place. She hadn't taken the time to remember his name, although she had met him several years ago at this point. 7 of her most intrinsic followers did the same, taking down political rivals in her stead. What remained would take the name of the Orchestra, and all would take the pledge of the Hash, or face certain doom. It was not global domination that the children sought, but resources. A fleet of 117, some hundreds short of its proposed capacity, would board the Sonnet and set the rebelling orchestra sailing across the unexplored azure. Steered to the tune of Belphegor's inconsistent humming, the Sonnet went south and southeast, and further south still, for many uncontested months until they found themselves at the mercy of a Goliath typhoon. Extreme weather conditions shook the ship and tipped the vessel, sending 117 loose bodies into the ocean, doomed to the depths, at the mercy of the cosmic force of calamity. One by one, the floating orchestra washed up, having survived their violent encounter with Mother Nature. Soaked to the bone, injured but not defeated, bruised skin lands hard on wet sand. An island, uncharted to the Dutch. Liberté recognized it immediately, and their trial had only served to strengthen her belief that some omnipotent being was dictating their every move. It was surely no coincidence that, no matter the distance they had rowed on the open drift, not one of their exiled faces had been snatched up by some other petulant god. A cautious limp around the island's shore made it clear that this was no pit stop. Palm trees, sand dunes, and rustic brush expanded infinitely over the horizon as far as that first day was long. Those who had followed would sleep beneath the tropical canopy together and allow time to fall around them whilst their leader and her intrinsic council marched into the midst. Amongst them was Isabel, the tallest and loudest of them all. She would tend to their morale with sea shanties, whilst the eldest, Cesar, plugged his ears. He would feed them, though. And when Liberté's aging body gave way under her inextinguishable drive, it was Perno who cut down the impassable vines, Hercule who carried her weight on his shoulders, and Ishmael rationed water. Finally, it was Gabriel whose sense of direction she trusted the most. Belphegor remained quiet, but Gabriel would rave on and on about the good feeling in her bones as they continued to venture inward, unknowingly surveying the entire island in a predetermined spiral towards its very center point, counterclockwise, never missing a natural landmark, so that when they met the middle, they knew what they were seeing was the very opposite. The hard lines and intentional phallism typically only found in human architecture, an obelisk of stone and soft metals dug from the earth around them and polished by mortal hands. At eye level, a sigil consisting of 4 threes had been conceived. 3 concentric circles confined 3 vertical lines beneath 3 waves around 3 supporting pillars, resembling an inverted Y shape. It was the seal of calamity, the handiwork of Belphegor himself. Amongst the rubble from which it had been crafted laid the frail bones of a long-extinct expedition, and carved into those bones was the very same symbol. None who still drew breath but Liberté recognized it. It had always followed the bearers of the coal, appearing amongst the honeycomb hallways of their maze-infested nightmares, or in between the written word. Upon this discovery, Liberté ordered her party to retreat and to return with the rest of the family in great haste for the final leg of their journey. The embellisher of calamity had not been idly watching the mortal plane from beyond the world lunette for these past centuries. No. Belphegor had been peering through many openings across the great tilling of the empty, and from each of them he could spy another to aid his grand quest. Decades before the birth of Liberté, when Pietro the Weakened held the coal and Belphegor fell silent, he was simply several steps ahead of them, whispering false promises to a man named Yaron, who convinced his small family to tie tree trunks together and sail across to an island that did not exist prior to that day. It had all been by design, cobbled together through centuries of patience and unflinching watchfulness, and it had all been because of Constance, or Nahash as she was known to them. He had learned, of course, that one frail vase of flesh and bone was no good. In his estimation, he would need 7 mortal frames, fit to burst with spiritual baggage. Those who found it first slashed their palms upon the altar, and bled upon that ancient sigil. Flames burst forth without warning, and their 7 mortal bodies were eclipsed and evaporated before any could cry out in pain. He had promised them a lifetime of immeasurable power. That's how the story went. That's what Nahash had told them generations ago. All for a momentary grasp at their reality because he could control it. For some reason, while powerless on their own plane, the remnants were able to alter aspects of the stationary plate. Belphegor, it would arise, could unweave the very threads of its realities by sheer willpower. Historical precedent aside, Belphegor meant his promise. After a few quiet moments of confusion and doubt, a much larger fountain of flame took to life, and within it stood a brand new being, composed of their bodies caped in cinders and standing 7 feet from head to toe. It was Belphegor, embellisher of calamity, in all his glorious warmth. As the flames subsided, the creature began to take shape. To those who bore witness, this form would become known as Sinis Nix, flesh hardened, burning red hot, deep as coal, harder than diamond. It wore a smouldering crown atop its cylindrical head, bore human lips, and held 6 fingers on each of its 4 hands. Each movement, however, cost Sinis Nix time on his side. Impermanent, as always, once again, this was not a form that could withstand Belphegor's presence. It would take much more time, he thought, and set about planting the seeds for the next generation of schemes. Instead of wandering free as it wished, Sinis Nix remained on the island. It spoke for 1 year straight, and whilst it gestured with one hand, it wrote 3 arcane tomes with the remaining 3. With its words, Sinis Nix changed those who bore witness on a then undiscovered biological level. Now attuned to the wavelengths of the world around them, these witches could manipulate matters beyond normal mortal comprehension. It would extend their lifespans tenfold, so that they could experience the true freedom that Belphegor desired. The books, they were for those who would come. Inside were reams of coded messages, techniques, and above all, the true path to calamity. Above all, it was imperative that the witches discover a way to create a vessel for their immortal master. As the spectre's last ember burned out, it blew up in spectacular fashion, as all good deities do, leaving behind artifacts of great power. In its final act, Sinis Nix brought back its 7 components in angelic forms, incomparable even to their evolved compatriots. Avatars of the 7 disciplines of magic, all powerful in all aspects of the makeup of Indigo. An intrinsic council, which would, much like the Shadow Society it devoured, define a new direction for humankind, all whilst considering the grand scheme of things. While those who had bore witness, the witches, returned to their lives in Europe, the Intrinsic Council remained on what they would call Grimacy Island. Here, an archive would be built to keep the 3 Nixian textbooks away from prying eyes. You have been listening to And the First Utterance of Magick, an episode of Pulp, Surreal Stories from a Nearby Skull, written and directed by Jake Lucy. This production is copyright 2020 by the Sleepy Bones Detective Agency and is intended for enjoyment purposes only. Any resemblance to actual persons living or dead is purely coincidental. If you would like to support the show, please visit our Patreon at patreon.com/sbda. Please visit us on the web at sleepybones.agency for more surreal stories.